A quick caveat. I'm not speaking about Tolkien today from any position of expertise, just from a love of mostly his fiction, though it has been a delight to spend time this spring listening to him talk about, reflect on what he thinks fairy tales do, myth, and imagination. And it turns out that a good deal of my own professional work, where I have spent my time in Renaissance English Lit, and my dissertation, I worked on Shakespeare's last plays, which are exceptional among his body of work because they incorporate the fantastical. They include aspects that Tolkien, although he thinks drama isn't the best genre for fantasy, would admit were Shakespeare's best attempts at fantasy. And this semester I get to teach a course on Spenser, Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, which is a major romantic epic in fairyland from the 1590s. So turns out as Tolkien engages I'm so sorry, because I'm losing track as I'm trying to find my presentation for you.
Just reload the middle tab.
Thank you. My point was, as he reflects on certain dimensions of the literature that I do in fact study professionally, he has been an illuminator of that. Mostly what I'm going to do today is talk you through the way that Tolkien accounts for the meaning of mythology, with the skeleton of my talk being from a poem he wrote, Mythopoeia, which means myth making, and I'll tell you a little bit about that and we'll walk through it. It's available in a volume, Tree and Leaf, which collects his 1938-39 lecture on fairy stories, this poem, Mythopoeia, which was probably written around 1931, and then Leaf by Nigel, a story he wrote later that has some degree of biography, a bit of a fable or myth that he wrote. The title of my talk that you can't see the whole of is Myth is Another Word for Word. And it's worth noticing that Tolkien, who's a philologist professionally, originally, who's studying language, becomes interested in the meaning of tales at first because he loves words themselves, and he becomes a writer of fantasy at first by writing out languages before he started doing anything else. So first we'll talk for a moment about Tolkien's bio and how it is that he came to be a person who commended fairy story or mythology the way that he does. Tolkien is good at introducing himself. This is an excerpt from a letter he wrote in 1958. I was born in 1892 and lived for my early years in the Shire in a pre-mechanical age. Or more important, I'm a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact a Roman Catholic. The latter fact perhaps cannot be deduced. I'm in fact a hobbit in all but size. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food. I like, and even dare to wear in these dull days, ornamental waistcoats. I am fond of mushrooms out of a field, have a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. I go to bed late and get up late when possible. I do not travel much. So, Tolkien's introduction of himself helps us to hear some of the resonance with the world he imagines for us. Tolkien was orphaned early in life. By the time he was 13, both of his parents had died, and he was raised in the care of a priest. He went to Oxford and graduated from there in 1915, married his wife, who he had met in his adolescence, the next year, and then went off to fight in the Great War. His own story, like I'm sure many British army men, was that he was alone the survivor of many of his companions. He began writing the Silmarillion, which is the set of unfinished legends and histories of the cosmos that inhabited Middle-earth. He began writing that while in convalescence during the war. And that fits in later. You'll be able to hear how that shows up in the way that he conceives of myth being born, not as an escape from the reality of sorrow and suffering and darkness, but as an operative hope in the face of great darkness. For nearly 15 years, he's imagining this world before he started to tell its particular stories. He wrote to one of his publishers that he was inventing its languages, the languages that mark the worlds of the Silmarillion, since childhood. And as a student of the history of language, he said he was able to grow in his own sophistication and nuance and develop a nexus of languages, though parenthetically he admits they're mostly only structurally sketched, so he didn't have a full, a filled out linguistic habit for everybody. Anyway, he's been inventing languages, he's inventing the world through language. He began teaching in Leeds. He had a season of his life where he worked on the Oxford English Dictionary, so you can hear again this deep interest in the history of language. The OED is primarily studying words over time. In 1925, he became a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, and still here he's doing language work far more than he's doing literature work. It's in Oxford that he became friends with C.S. Lewis in 1926. That'll be a bummer if I just lost all of the Prezi. Okay, he became friends with Lewis in 1926, Lewis pre-conversion. And just a couple other details. In 1937, one of his major contributions to literary scholarship is his article, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics. In 1937, he also released The Hobbit. This piece that we're looking at, the fairy stories, which will show up in my talk today, was delivered in 1938 at St. Andrews in the Andrew Lang Lecture Series, and in 1939, I think it was published. Lord of the Rings is published 1954 to 1955. In 1945, Tolkien became the Merton Chair of English Languages and Literature, so by then he has expanded his academic horizon to include the teaching of literature beyond just the teaching of language, and his death was in the year 1973. So, we'll start. Again, the skeleton of my talk is going to follow the argument of this poem called Mythopoeia. The occasion of the poem, by Tolkien's account, was a walk after dinner that he took with C.S. Lewis and another friend, Hugo Dyson, probably on September 19th, 1931, because Tolkien says the background of these lines is the groves and walks of Magdalen at night. And Lewis wrote a letter to a friend describing a conversation they had that night. Lewis's letter writes, "We walked and talked of metaphor and myth, interrupted by a rush of wind which came so suddenly on this still warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We all held our breath, the other two appreciating the ecstasy of such a thing almost as you would." In another letter, he says they were talking of the true myth and the story of Christ. So Lewis is, at this point, not a convert to Christianity, and the subject of the conversation is really where we can see Tolkien's Mythopoeia as a model for integration. Because the subject of their conversation was, look at how the history of mythology has had so many stories that are really similar to the story of Christianity. What do we do with the fact that pre-Christian folks have speculated about, for instance, being created by gods, or a dying god reviving and bringing about life? What about the fact that these stories have been told by all sorts of folks, and Christians try to say this happened in time? Well, Tolkien has quite a strong opinion about this, and it's that in fact this is all evidence, or at least a happy notion of the truth. And at this point, Lewis is pretty much sure that this means that we're all full of wishful thinking, that we all want something to be true that's not, and we keep postulating fantasy. What I want to notice about Tolkien's methodology with respect to integration of faith and learning, and I think this will bear out as I unpack this for you. Tolkien doesn't press into the authority of divine revelation, nor does he press into the experience of faith. He talks about the fact that it's plausible that the reason that we all tell these stories is that they're true, and then he talks about desirability. So Tolkien's mode of integration of faith and learning, at least with respect to this question, he has heard the witness of faith, and he says the reason that you make a choice for it would be because this seems both plausible and, in fact, very desirable. So it's a natural theological method by a lot. Okay, so this beginning of the Mythopoeia, this poem, it has, in its multiple versions, it has multiple epigraphs, including JRRT to CSL, Philomythus, which is the lover of myth, to Misomythus, the hater of myth. And it also has a sentence, to one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. In this first section of the poem, we get an account from Tolkien of the myth hater's way of seeing things. It's scientific and sterile. You can notice there's a univocal use of language that the first lines betray. You look at trees and label them so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow. As we walk through the poem, we'll see that Tolkien thinks the way we name and describe the world meaningfully unfolds our sensibility. So to say a tree is to univocally name and not think that there's meaning in the naming. The second thing you can see here is there's a materialistic explanation of things, saying that a thing is certainly and only what it's made of. A star's a star, some matter in a ball. So what is a star might not be answered correctly by the account of what it's made of. But here we see that the myth hater wants to say a star is what it's made of. You can also hear a fatalism in this part of the poem. Destined atoms are being slain. There's a will which we bend to and must, but we only dimly apprehend. So there's a kind of materialism and fatalism. There's variety without unity. An endless multitude of forms appear. Each are alien, except as kin from one remote origin. So the variety of objects that we find in the world has no plausible unity that we could ever discover. So there's also the account of any kind of excitement that we might bear. And if you think back to Lewis saying when the leaves started to fall and it was a moment of wonder for everyone else, and seems like it was not for him, here you get a sort of biochemical account of excitement, that there are nerves that tingle when we're touched by light and sound, but no admission that something more might be happening. Also notice that the myth hater might use adjectives. We'll talk about adjectives on the next slide, the myth lover's use of adjectives. But the myth hater might use adjectives, but they're all redundant. Petrious rocks, the arboreal trees, Tellurian earth and stellar stars, right? You're just repeating the same word. They're starry stars, they're manly men, they're rocky rocks. There's no adjectival use that discovers anything fantastic, which Tolkien eventually, and on Fairy Story says, right in adjectives, we start to sense fairyland. And there's an empiricist epistemology that the things that we behold, that our nerves get tingled with, they're each duly registered and print the brain's contortions with a separate dent. And you can hear Locke and Hume and their account of how ideas get formed in the mind right there. All right, so the myth hater explains the world materialistically, fatalistically, and univocally. Second slide, second part of the poem. Here we start to get the reply, an explicit rebuttal. Trees are not trees until so named and seen. So here Tolkien's voice, or the myth lover's voice, starts to come out, and we get to hear that what mythology opens up and fairy story opens up, and I'm going to use those words interchangeably. Tolkien wants to be careful about what he means by fairy story, but he's also wider in the definition by a lot than saying stories where their inhabitants are fairies or elves. So we'll leave that alone if you can endure my interchangeable use of myth and fairy story. Here we can see in this poem that the myth lover says that the understanding of the cosmos that he's going to argue for all starts with language. It all starts with why things get named the way they do. In his essay or talk on fairy stories, Tolkien says as soon as we use adjectives, and the fact that adjectives are structurally a part of our language, this is the beginning of the possibility of a creativity that imagines fairyland. He says, the mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water. When we say the grass is green, we're noticing a difference between greenness and grassiness. And so he says, when we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we already have the enchanter's power on one plane. And the desire to wield that power in the world external to our mind awakes. In such fantasy, as it is called, a new form is made. So as soon as we make a face green or sun turn into, and now I'm going to do an injustice, I'll just stick with his. As soon as the rock turns into water, a new form is made. And he says that's the birth of fairy. That is the work that he's interested in as a myth lover and as a defender of fairy stories. So it starts with adjectives, which he calls the fantastic device of human language, because they're the beginning of our power of fantasy to imagine or make the world other than as it is. In this next part of the poem, he moves through from talking about naming to talking about the elves. And it's worth noting that Tolkien is careful in his On Fairy Stories to say it's a lame part of the literary tradition that we have come up with an account of fairies as these diminutive beings. They're severe and serious. He returns to talking about elves often, I think, in an attempt to recover this sense of the creatures who are somehow mirrors of man that inhabit this other realm called fairyland. It may or may not help you to know, Spenser in The Fairy Queen tells the history of elf as Prometheus. So there's this second creation story that abides in the ancient myths, that Prometheus stole fire from heaven to enliven a humanoid creature, and Spenser says that is the first elf. The man that Prometheus made is elf, and elf ventures about and finds his way into the garden of Adonis, a dying god who revives in Spenser, and there he meets Fae, the beautiful, his beautiful partner and spouse and mate, and then all of fairyland is populated from elf and fae. So that's not foreign to the way that Tolkien is thinking of elf, but it's not also the only way that he's thinking about elf. You can hear in that this alternative creation story that then imagines a second world that's something like ours, where gods create and men find wives and so forth. This becomes the story of fairyland. One of the functions of fairy stories, as Tolkien would have it, is recovery. And we start to hear in this second portion of the poem instances of what he calls recovery. Recovery is our need as we grow old and tired of things as they are, as we lose wonder, as we increase in our blasé encounters with the world as it is. We need ways of refreshing and recovering the clear sense of the world. He says it's not so much that by recovery we see things as they are, but that we see things as we were made to see them. So even more than I need to see the object as it is, I need to experience it as other than me and wildly alive with significance for its very being. So what fairy story might do to create that possibility, by imagining the world otherwise, sometimes that means it invests things as they are with rich significance. In this part of the poem, he says, the myth lover, that anybody sees no stars who does not see them first of living silver that made the sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song. So he's saying to see stars as we're meant to see them is to perhaps believe them to be sung into being from liquid silver, not to think of them as gaseous balls of matter, which happen to be, I don't know, is it on fire? I don't even know what stars are made of. Burning gases. Stars are made of burning gases. Yes? I study Renaissance English literature. Whew. Okay. So this section of the poem gives us a bit of an acquaintance with the connection that Tolkien wants to make between adjectives as core to our linguistic structure and the fast move to the invention of whole tales, fairyland. And it also helps us to hear this function of fairyland, which is to, for human creatures, recover our sensibility and experience the world, regain sight as we were meant to. Oh, this, by the way, it's a shared, it is a shared conviction among the Inklings. When they talk about fairy story, or C.S. Lewis applies this to Edmund Spenser in particular, they keep talking about the advantages of fairy story as being mainly for mental health. I've really loved reflecting on that and hoping that there's the possibility that the right kinds of literatures and stories and tales could be a part of our recovery of actually mental health. And you can hear later, we'll continue to hear how that's playing out. This third part of the poem, Tolkien starts to ground this notion of language and elves and so forth. He says, starts to answer the question, why would human creatures be capable of this? Why would it be written into our language from the beginning? And why would it be one of our first primordial habits to make up fantastical stories? And he says the source of myths is God through man's subcreative power, which is given to him at his birth, because we are born into the image of God, who is himself a maker, and we are given commandments of dominion, which create primordial desires, and we are given the privilege of naming. And so this commandment of dominion, which would help us to rule and reign with a kind of communion of being with the whole created order, and then this privilege of using our linguistic capacity to do that. Tolkien says that's why we're myth makers. He admits that we are in a complicated place as far as our myth making goes. So he says the heart of man is not composed of lies. We're not lying when we make up stories, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. So we have some, primordial is the word that Tolkien returns to. We have a primordial memory that in fact informs our storytelling. And though we are now long estranged from even our first selves, right? Man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned. He keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, and his world dominion by creative act. And then Tolkien goes on to call man sub-creator. I think, just a quick aside, the disgraced, though not dethroned, I think that Tolkien seems to operate with a really good Thomistic tradition of nature and grace. So he's saying it was natural to us to be myth makers, to be sub-creators. So though we have lost grace in our fall, we have not lost all of our natural, we have not lost all of our nature. Well, on fairy stories, here we get the strong claim that it's in our created nature that we become storytellers. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tale are in our world coeval. God made in his image creatures who have incarnate mind, a tongue, and they quickly become tale tellers. This second quotation should help us to notice the way that Tolkien says we were at our birth given desires. The two that he names are to survey the depths of space and time, and the second is to hold communion with other living things. I think that Tolkien is connecting these to dominion that's given to the human creature in his lordship. And so he says that part of the function of fairyland is the satisfaction of these certain primordial desires that we know are not satisfied in our historical experience. But again, it's back to creation. And the last quote to read from on fairy stories about man's nature as sub-creator is that fantasy remains a human right though we abuse it. And Tolkien regularly admits that this power to tell stories is not always for the good, that like all other human power, we have often used it for destruction. So though we abuse it, we make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made. And not only made, but made in the image of a maker. In that section, oh, look at that. We'll have to run through those again real fast. In the poem, the final lines there are, we make still by the law in which we are made. And that law, of course, is that we are made in the image of a maker. All right, to the fourth section of the poem, which starts to tell us about the particular rebuttal to the question, is myth all wish fulfillment? And when we tell good stories and stories with perhaps happy endings or triumphs over evil, or any of the number of ills that we can't abide in the human world, when we tell stories where those are perhaps overcome, are we becoming escapists and full of wish fulfillment? So Tolkien in the first stanza says, yes, wish fulfillment dreams we spin to cheat our timid hearts and ugly fact to defeat. But whence came the wish, and whence the power to dream, or some things fair and others ugly deem? All wishes are not idle nor in vain, fulfillment we devise. For pain is pain, not for itself to be desired, but ill, or else to strive or to subdue the will alike were graceless in here. And of evil, this alone is deadly certain, evil is. So Tolkien wants to say, the myth maker never turns their eye from the reality of the terrible and the ways that desires are frustrate in this world. And in fact, the myth maker might, and this is where I think it is compelling to think of Tolkien starting to build in his own imagination the whole world of the Valinor, Numenor, and Middle Earth, while he is grieving the end of the world as he's known it, as the Great War has taken the lives of all of the youth he has grown up with, right? So here's a sad day, but he starts to think, what if this evil that does not have the final word? I took a clip. The next part of the poem has 3 blessed R's, 3 pronouncements of blessing, and they have to do with the kind of hope and faith and love that the myth maker models. It reminded me so much of this moment where Sam Gamgee, you guys might remember this from The Lord of the Rings. Sam is in the Tower of Cirith Ungol, and it's after Frodo's been attacked by Shelob, and Sam had thought him dead, but the orcs steal Frodo's body, right, and then take it to this tower, and Sam overhears them explaining that Frodo's not dead, he just had been paralyzed, but he's captive, and Sam is going to try to rescue him. But he gets to the top of the tower, as top as he thinks he can get, and he can't find Frodo. And so he sits at the top of this tower, and he really thinks he's defeated. And he thinks this is plausibly the end of the story as far as his own life goes, and Frodo's life, and the possible destruction of the ring. And then he starts to sing old songs until a new one comes to him. And I'm going to play this little setting of the song that Sam sings. It in fact becomes the way that he gets to rescue Frodo. So the orc who has captured Frodo thinks Frodo's being annoying and singing, so he gets a ladder and he goes up there to shut Frodo up. Sam gets to follow Snagga the orc up the ladder. Oh my goodness, I really did just tell that whole part of the Lord of the Rings. Oh.
The flowers may rise in
sorry, is there an easy way to make this audible for all of you? Thank you. No. That didn't work.
Tap it again.
Perfect. Okay, now we'll listen. Thank you for enduring that.
The merry finches sing in western lands beneath the sun. The flowers may rise in spring, the trees may bud, the waters run. The merry finches sing. Or there may be 'tis cloudless night, and swaying beeches bear the elven stars as jewels white amid their branching hair. Though here at journey's end I lie, in darkness buried deep, beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep. Above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell.
Tolkien makes a grand distinction in his On Fairy Stories between escapism and desertion. And he says that if you're in prison and you long for escape, you're not being an absurd person. You're insisting that the world outside still is, though you may not see it in any kind of deliverance, but your desire for escape is a desire for a world that is. Desertion, on the other hand, which is what Tolkien wants to say many mean when they say fantasy's escapist, is that it's avoiding the reality, it's abandoning the fight because the world is painful and that's all the world is. So escape would be a kind of desertion from the world as it is. Tolkien says creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun. It's founded on a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. And so he seems to want to say that one faithful way to acknowledge the evil of evil is to hope for its end. And to imagine the world outside. Sam says, I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell, even though he thinks he will never see again the light of day. All right, I'm going to skip this next part. It's the section 5. A good portion of it is Tolkien saying, I want to be among the legend makers, and he also gets sassy about modernity and the combustion engine and the Iron Age, because he wants to say, there's a kind of escapism that might be archaic, and that's okay too if I hate the ugliness of the modern manufacturer. And you can think, of course, of lots of parts of Lord of the Rings that seem to bear resemblance. Saruman's destruction of the trees outside of Isengard to make Uruk-hai, etc. But the conclusion of the poem is the place where Tolkien starts to talk about paradise. And it's worth helping you make the jump between this blessed are those who hope that though it's dark, they will see the light again. Tolkien talks about one of the great joys of the fairy story is the consolation that it offers in happy ending. And he says that the height of drama as a genre is to do tragedy well. And tragedy, of course, hangs on catastrophe. It hangs on the reversal of fortune so that someone who had happiness loses it. And drama, according to Aristotle and those that follow, can do this fantastic thing for its audience where we feel pity and fear at the loss of fortune from the tragic hero. So Tolkien says that's what drama does at its best. What fairy story does at its best is, let's call it, he says, eucatastrophe. Let's say it's the happy turn of fortune. And he says it's actually not even fair to say it's a happy ending, because the fairy story ends in a turn, and a turn that suggests life that goes on. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale. It's its highest function. He also insists, just like we heard in the last part, that happy ending or eucatastrophe does not deny the possibility of discatastrophe, of sorrow or pain, nor does it see the joyous turn as inevitable, which actually in that way it might be different than tragedy. In tragic theory, the fall, the turn of fortune for the tragic hero is sometimes believed to be inevitable. Here he says, no, it's always a miracle of grace, that there is the reversal of fortune for the good of the story. He says, so it does not deny the possibility of discatastrophe, nor does it see the joyous turn as inevitable, but, and this is a quote, it denies, in the face of much evidence, universal final defeat. And insofar as it denies this universal final defeat, it is evangelium, it is good news, it is gospel, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And so, as Tolkien finishes up his story, his essay on fairy stories, he gives an epilogue where he talks about how as we start to think about the good news of the fairy story, he says he's going to be bold and say it makes me think about the good news of the gospel, which has all of the felt resonance with myth and with fairy story. So he says that the incarnation is, of course, the happy ending of the decline of the human story. And then the resurrection is the happy ending of the incarnation. He says the wonderful discovery is not how much it resonates with all of the particular qualities we say fairy story has, which, of course, is a secondary world, a sub-creation. He says, but then it turns out that all of this secondary and sub-creation stuff turns out to be primary. And it is in fact creation. Creation, incarnation, and resurrection are all primary world's realities. And so he says that because the great story is true, art has been verified. Redeemed man is still man. So story, fantasy, they'll still go on and should. The gospel has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The end of his poem, the end of his story Leaf by Niggle, hopes that the things that have been made by makers in this world will have some life in the life of the world to come. He has this story Leaf by Niggle where the painter has been trying to paint a tree that belongs in a little countryside, but he dies before it's finished, which you can hear probably, and Dr. Mitchell suggested this is true, so I'll rely on his authority, that there's autobiography there, that Tolkien has his own sense. He hasn't finished the Silmarillion. He dies before it's done. But in this story Leaf by Niggle, the place gets to be in the world to come, and it's called by these sort of angelic creatures. It's described at the end as a good place for holiday and refreshment. It's splendid for convalescence, and not only that, for many it's the best introduction to the mountains, this sort of paradisal journey that's ahead for all that die. For many, this space that Niggle had created in his art is the best introduction to the mountains, and it works wonders in some cases. So to conclude, to some extent, this is of course autobiographical. Tolkien not having finished all of the work he wanted to in the worlds that he was making, these secondary worlds, these histories that he began writing while his companions fell left and right in the Great War, the cosmos that held Middle-earth and more, it was unfinished at the time of his own death. But if Tolkien is right in his intuitions, and he continues to be himself in paradise, there may already be a more perfect Valinor, Numenor, and Middle-earth even now. And it's certainly been the case that even the parts of his world that remain for us have been at least great holiday and certain refreshment and splendid for convalescence. And not only that, but for many, they have been the best introduction to the mountains, the realm where creation fulfills longing even better than does his subcreation. It's that space where the gospel is fantastically true, and as Lewis later convinced and converted in part by Tolkien's witness, he was able to say that myth became fact. And we have much to be grateful for in that.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.